application is, these are sort of the general rules. Read the guidelines, and read the guidelines again, and make sure that the application is complete, and make sure that the application is responsive. And I can tell you, I just applied for this fund not too long ago for research projects I'm doing, and I don't know how many times I was doing 3 projects at once. This is my justification to myself. I was writing 3 grants all at the same time. And on this one, I sit on this committee. How many times have I said it needs a dissemination plan? How many times have I said it needs, what was the other piece I missed? Something else. Timeline, right? But sure enough, they were in the other grant, and I just didn't put them in this one. So
Yeah.
I was applying for this for grant to support the same project. So I had the whole different pieces, and I was reassembling them. And I'm sure that students are writing their proposal and getting ready to collect their data, and they have lots of files too, and they often don't get everything. So just making sure that you have a checklist for yourself. There is a checklist attached to the application, so you can make sure everything is the case. Let's talk about this word responsive. Panel, do you have a sense of what does responsive mean to you?
Well, let me start off by saying that 50% of the proposals that we get internally are either non-responsive or incomplete. So it's not unusual. And when I talk to the panelists on NSF and NIH and Department of Education, it's very similar. But responsiveness. What I tell people is, have you ever had a conversation with somebody where you've asked them a question? 20 minutes later, you're into this conversation and they still have not answered the question? That's non-responsiveness, but in this case, it's in a written form. So in order to understand a reviewer's perspective, we have a stack of 20 proposals. Your proposal is number 19. They are wading through your proposal, you know, maybe 10 pages or something, and they are still waiting for that answer. That's the issue with non-responsiveness. It's almost worse than having the conversation. So non-responsiveness is not asking or answering the question. If you think of the guidelines as a list of questions, your proposal are the answers to those questions. Make sure you understand the question so that your answers are responsive.
In this application, we often have non-responsiveness in terms of things that people are pulling from their dissertation proposal and sticking there. They have some narrative and they put it in response to the question, but it doesn't really answer the question. I mean, you can see the temptation in doing that. You've already written this big long thing, and so surely I can cut and paste, and you can to a degree, but making sure that it answers the question in as terse a way as possible. Sometimes we have guidelines on this proposal for how many words, and sometimes we get a lot more than put in the guidelines, and we're not real fussy about that. But lots of places are. I've applied online for grants where it cuts you off if the character goes beyond their limit. It's like, okay, I don't know what Reese without an RCH is, but that's where I ended up. So you do have to keep track of
I think that the problem with just cutting and pasting sometimes doesn't really work for these applications, that you have to kind of tailor them and create their own story behind it so that it flows logically, so that the reader can really understand what you're trying to communicate, as opposed to separate entities that are just kind of all stuck together, you think, are kind of all flowing and answering the question. I think that's where people kind of run into some problems.
And I think that there's a fundamental difference in the way that we write certain documents. A dissertation very often is a bit of a chronology of our thought process as we've gone through the project. It's sort of the pretty prose, once upon a time, the end. A grant is very different. It's what's called the argumentative statement. This is what I'm going to do, this is why you should fund me. Basically, the end is up front. And then you have the substantive, background behind it, which can be very different from your dissertation, where you're sort of, foregrounding everything with your background, and then explaining the project.
So in this particular fund, the application includes 3 big parts: the contact information and kind of front material sheet, the abstract, which is a brief statement of the proposal and the budget. And in a larger grant, you might have an abstract followed by an extensive narrative, but here we have a more than typically extensive abstract that we include. It's surprising how many of the fields that are, I'm the example of even knowing what to do, not doing it, but we do see people who don't add things like their advisor's name or the grant amount that they put on the front sheet is not the same as the grant amount that's in the budget. So just being extremely careful to make sure that everything's filled in as what the contact information is. The big piece is the abstract. So I'd kind of like the panelists to kind of give their take on what a rationale is for a research study.
Sure. I know Andrew's in my class right now, so we've discussed a rationale pretty in depth, and their final paper is all geared around writing a rationale. But kind of drawing on what was just previously said with regards to putting what's important up front, I view the rationale as answering two very basic questions. Why is this study important? Or why is this study important? What are the variables that I'm looking at? I want to know, and why are they significant? And so then by that, I can understand that, I can buy into that this is something worthwhile and worthwhile to fund because you've explained the significance of that project. And sometimes it's really easy to break that down into components, and every study is going to be very different, but you're basically looking either at a phenomenon related to a population segment or a problem. And so I want to know, what is the problem and why is that problem significant? So that's kind of what I see in that rationale section, and concluding with some sort of purpose statement. That therefore, based on everything that's come, the purpose of this study is to look at this, or examine or investigate this. And so that really provides me with some clarity and understanding of what's really important about this study.
Which is probably why you can't just cut and paste, because to make that very concise is so long in a dissertation proposal, so.
Yeah. I mean, your chapter one, at least from my own experiences, chapter one is always built around the rationale of the study, and you don't have the ability to write 6 pages on it. You're supposed to do it in 500 to 1,000 words, and so that's really challenging. And I'm sure, like I tell students in that class, writing 5 to 6 pages on a rationale is challenging too. To put everything down in that amount of space, and so if you truncate that or shrink that down, it's even harder. It can be a really tough task, and I think from a reviewer standpoint, it's almost like selling your study. You have to sell it. And
you have to make them feel guilty.
Yeah.
Best proposals make the reviewers feel guilty if they don't fund you.
Like by the end of the rationale, I should be able to say, yeah, we should fund this. That's pretty interesting. I should have some engagement in the study by the end of the rationale.
There are also some different kinds of rationales that can be built, and students will do this in their proposals. If you're writing a research article, at any point in your career you do this. But one rationale relates to the practicality of what it is you're studying. In our college, a lot of our fields are applied fields, and so we want to learn whether a certain approach works better than another approach, or we want to learn whether teachers prefer or coaches prefer an approach to another approach. These are all things with a practical reason for the answer. But practical rationales are not the only ones. And we certainly have some theoretical and more kind of pure science sorts of studies in college as well. There, the rationale is often based on a gap in the literature. We've gotten to this point of our knowledge, but we haven't yet asked the next question in a kind of logical sequence of investigations that explore and open up new territory in pedagogy or in recreation studies or in coaching or in counseling or in instructional technology or whatever our field might be.
I think the other thing that I would suggest, and I know that I've talked about this in our classes, is that it needs to be constructed in such a way that it builds on itself. So that it's almost this logical sequence where if you have different variables that you're interested in, you're explaining how those are related in a logical way. I think a lot of people want to jump to certain areas, and for a reviewer it might not make sense. So if you can create an argument, which is really, that's what the rationale, it's an argument for why I should be funded or why this study's worthwhile. It should be done in such a way that, you know, is logical, that things flow together and build on each other.
I agree with everything that's been said. One of the first things that I always advise my students when it's a short form like this, first sentence should be, what are you going to do? I really want to see that up front. The goal of this study is to examine this. The next set, and it doesn't have to be this way, but I'm a very, you know, stepwise logical person. The next thing I usually go is, okay, now why am I studying this? I'll go to the literature example. This study has been performed in this population. It showed this. Now we want to translate it to this population, for example. The next sentence after that, don't forget to go back and say, how is your study going to address that need? A lot of the times, our proposals say, they've got a goal, they've identified the need, but they forget to go back to the significance of how their study is actually going to address that need. And that's really important. One of the kiss of death that I always think in this part of the proposal is if somebody says it's never been done before, or they don't acknowledge the literature. Because what does that say to you? Somebody says it's never been done before. What are your responses to that?
Maybe experts don't think that it needed to be done.
That's right, maybe it doesn't need to be done, or maybe it can't be done. I mean, literally. And I understand that there are a lot of transformative research projects out there, but usually you can ground it in some basis, either the methodology or the population study, such that you can contextualize it to something that's been done. It makes your project seem more doable. Okay? So you don't want people questioning whether or not your project is feasible. So for me, a rationale is, why is the project worthwhile, but also, is it feasible?